There was a time when anyone would tremble upon hearing the name John D. Rockefeller. Not only was he the world's first billionaire, he's one of the richest people in history. His empire, Standard Oil, became the most dominant monopoly in the world by brutally crushing competitors, taking control of multiple industries, bribing the government into submission, and treating business as if it was war. Because of his ruthless business practices and secretive deals, Rockefeller made many enemies. His career is filled with bitter rivalries like with Andrew Carnegie, and even ferocious battles against US presidents. But before he was the titan of the oil industry, Rockefeller was at the very bottom of society. His story is one of only a handful of cases where someone manages to rise from the depth of poverty to the absolute peak of wealth and power. Rockefeller's story is at times inspiring, and at times chilling. It's an example of what happens when greed and ambition go completely unchecked. So, let me take you back to 1839, where a young John D. Rockefeller is born into poverty. In 1839, John D. Rockefeller was the first child born into a family of peasant farmers with no cash to spare. In his small town of less than 1,000, the most mysterious character to be found was undoubtedly John's father, who was known as Devil Bill. Instead of helping on the family farm, Bill did just about anything else. He was an athlete, ventriloquist, hunter, hypnotist, and even an animal trainer. Once he won a bear in a competition, kept it as a pet, and taught it to do tricks. Bill did a little of this, a little of that, but not much of anything. Bill would also spontaneously skip town in the middle of the night, leaving John and his siblings to fend for themselves for weeks or even months, only to reappear in a luxurious carriage and shower John and his siblings with toys and gifts. And this confused John, because his family lived in a crumbling old house, wore tattered clothes, and they were hungry and cold every night. They lived a pitiful life, with these occasional bouts of luxury when his father returned. And the reason for that was because Bill lived a secret double life as a con artist. Whenever he disappeared, Bill changed his name from William Rockefeller to Dr. William Livingston, and travelled from town to town selling useless herbal remedies and potions to the sick and desperate. Because Bill was usually far away running scams, John's mother enlisted John's help working at the farm, where she instilled a strong religious faith and sense of duty in him whilst they ploughed the fields. For a boy younger than 10, balancing school and farming was backbreaking, but it taught him the value of discipline and hard work. John was proud to be helping his family out. In fact, he even started coming up with other ways to make money. For example, John once followed a wild turkey into the woods, stole its eggs, and raised the hatchlings. When they matured into turkeys, John sold some of them for a tidy profit, and kept the rest so he could get more eggs and repeat the process. Despite his young age, John was now pitching in a few dollars every week, and was making a serious impact on the family's finances. It looked like the Rockefellers might finally have a decent and stable life. However, when John was 10, his father Bill was accused of sexually assaulting a young woman. Even though nothing was proven, the Rockefellers still faced public disgrace, and so they were forced to pack their bags and find a new home. You'd think after this event, Bill would dial back his schemes, his infidelity, and focus on healing his relationships to his family. But instead, he did the complete opposite. Whilst using his fake identity of Dr. William Livingston, Bill married another woman in a different state where no one recognized him. Of course, he kept this a secret, and neither John's mother nor the other woman ever knew he had two wives. But the effect was evident. Bill was almost never around. So the Rockefellers moved from town to town, and John took on more responsibility as the unofficial head of the household. All whilst going to school, he kept finding ways to make money, manage the family's finances, and he even started giving out very small loans. Finally, the Rockefellers found a good home in Cleveland, Ohio, but now that John was 16 and nearly done with school, he wondered what the next phase of his life would be. John wanted to go to college, but by this point he had 4 siblings and a 5th on the way. And since John's father was absent even more than normal now that he had his secret other wife, John's mother relied on John to help pay for their food, housing, and education. This meant college was out of the question. John had to get to work immediately. And so, just 2 months before his graduation, John dropped out of school and began looking for a job in Cleveland. He was after something big, so he made a list of all the biggest railroads, banks, and wholesale merchants in the city. However, every time John showed up to an interview, people laughed in his face when they found out he was only 16 years old. John faced rejection after rejection, but no amount of humiliation was going to stop him, and after 6 long weeks, he got an interview at a small firm that needed help with bookkeeping. When they saw John's excellent penmanship, they decided to give him a chance and told him to get to work immediately, not even mentioning how much he'd get paid. John was ecstatic, and for the rest of his life, he celebrated September 26th as a personal holiday he called Job Day. To him, it was even more important than his own birthday. Even though it was not a massive operation, John's first job taught him how to deal with suppliers, pay bills, and see the inner workings of a real business for the first time. One day, his boss came in with a check for $4,000 and put it inside a safe. John knew the safe's combination, so when his boss was gone, he opened it up just so he could hold the note in his hands, hypnotized by how much it represented. John dreamed of someday making as much money as his bosses, and so every morning before heading off to work, he began repeating to himself, "I am bound to be rich." On the last day of 1855, John's bosses gave him his payment, $50, which meant he'd only earned a little over 50 cents a day. It wasn't much, but since he'd done such a good job, his bosses raised his salary to $300 per year, the equivalent of around $11,000 today. The raise gave John something he deeply wanted, independence from his father. Now, with his mother's help, he could finally give his family the stable life they yearned for. And from early on in his career, John personally gave around 10% of his salary to various charitable causes. But after 2 years of diligent work, a recession slowed the business down, and one of the founders quit the firm. All of his responsibilities fell onto John, who became the company's lead accountant. However, John knew the economic downturn had caused a sharp decline in the firm's revenues, and he suspected that soon the firm may have to close down completely. And yet, John wasn't worried. His 2 years of experience in the job had given him a huge amount of confidence, and so John was already planning his biggest move yet. John D. Rockefeller was ready to start his own company. During his first job, John had become friends with Maurice Clark, a 28-year-old chemist who worked down the street from him. Even though John was just 18 years old at this point, he'd developed a good reputation as a bookkeeper in Cleveland, and one day Maurice told him he was planning on starting a produce business, and suggested that they partner up together. After saving up a bit of money, they formed Clark and Rockefeller, and got to work buying and reselling grain, fish, beans, meat, and other foods. It was tough at first. John and Maurice were often exhausted from looking for customers out on the road, but owning their own business gave them immense pride. And even though he was a bit shy and quiet at first, John was a capable salesman. Because he was so mature, everyone called him Mr. Rockefeller. The older men in the industry easily trusted him, and the list of clients at Clark and Rockefeller quickly grew. In fact, their biggest problem was that they didn't have the capital needed to scale the business and handle even more clients. But John and Maurice found a smart way to solve this problem. If they wanted to seek a $5,000 loan, they would go around Cleveland saying their firm was looking to invest $10,000, very publicly giving the impression that they had plenty of cash. This simple trick meant the banks were more willing to give them money. And the extra loans they got put them in a great position when the American Civil War broke out, as business picked up even more. As a devout Baptist, John was very strongly opposed to slavery, so he wanted the Union to win the war. However, John was still responsible for feeding his family of 6, and if he stopped working, they wouldn't have any income. So instead of serving in the army himself, John paid $300 for a substitute and even paid to equip several more Union soldiers. The war gave a huge boost to the economy of the northern states, and Cleveland became an important strategic location for the Union. Local food prices were massively inflated, so John's produce business quadrupled almost overnight. In 1862, John and Maurice cleared a profit of $17,000, over $500,000 in today's money. Not bad for a 23-year-old, but an opportunity to multiply his wealth even more soon came across John's desk. You see, before electricity, people used to light their homes at night by burning oil inside of a lamp. Usually this oil came from whale fat, but finding and hunting down whales was costly and difficult, and sadly, some whales had been hunted down to the point of extinction. However, in 1859, someone in Pennsylvania discovered that by using a tall wooden structure known as an oil derrick, you could extract industrial amounts of crude oil by drilling straight into the ground. Mining crude oil this way was cheap, and it was fairly easy. Profits came quickly, and since so many people were made rich by the oil boom, crude oil was given the nickname Black Gold. And that's when John was introduced to Samuel Andrews, a young man who was looking for investors to build a crude oil refinery in Cleveland, which was only a day's ride away from the Pennsylvania oil regions. Andrews had a huge advantage over most of the competition. He discovered that if you applied sulfuric acid to crude oil, it would essentially purify it and turn it into kerosene. When burned, kerosene lasted longer and shined brighter than crude oil. It was a simple process, but the secret was closely guarded by the few who had discovered it. Now that John and Maurice had plenty of money to spare because of how successful their produce business was, they thought it would be wise to diversify their business, and thus they loaned Andrews $4,000 to set up his oil refinery. But to begin, they considered this as a side venture. John and Maurice kept managing their produce business and let Andrews handle the refinery by himself. Setting it up was remarkably simple, and because kerosene was a superior product to crude oil, it began selling like crazy. John couldn't ignore the numbers anymore. Within only a year, the oil refinery had become the most profitable side of the business. Together, John and Maurice decided to make a bold move. They abandoned their previous business and went all in on the oil industry. However, their initial enthusiasm was met by a massive challenge. The supply of oil was always in an unpredictable state. At this point, oil had only been found in one small region of Pennsylvania, so many people thought that it would eventually run out. Whenever someone struck a massive oil field, an entire town of oil miners would suddenly form around the site, drill every last drop, and then the town would disappear just as quickly as it had formed. Because of this, there were periods where oil was overabundant and prices would dip as low as 10 cents. But on the flip side, if it seemed like the oil was running out, then prices would suddenly rise all the way up to $14. So, to say that the oil market was turbulent would be an understatement. To mitigate this effect slightly, John decided to stay out of mining oil and concentrate only on refining oil. But for John and Maurice, the situation was still extremely stressful. When oil was easy to find, they weren't as profitable as prices were low. And when the wells were running dry, they feared that the last drop had finally been found and they'd soon have nothing to sell. The uncertainty was too much to handle for Maurice, and in 1865, he agreed to sell his share of the business to John. This was the tipping point of his career. Scared to his bones, but with a calm exterior, John agreed to buy Maurice's share of the company for $72,500, or $1.35 million in today's money. Maurice was cashing out, whilst John was doubling down and going all in on the seemingly risky oil business. However, it seemed like John's daily affirmation that he was bound to be rich was quickly becoming a reality, because just as the deal was going down, a gigantic new oil field was found in the Pennsylvania oil regions, finally undoing any doubts he had about oil running out. Of course, the market was still very competitive, so if John truly wanted to become as wealthy as he desired, he would have to brutally crush his competition. The year before buying his business partner's share of the company, John married a woman who shared his religious devotion. Even though he was now making good money, John bought a modest house in Cleveland where they began to raise a family. So with his home life in order and the northern economy booming after the Union Army won the Civil War, everything was ready for John to begin building his empire. Now that his partner was gone, John rebranded the company under a new name, Standard Oil, and he got to work building a second refinery and began exporting kerosene to Europe. John was confident that the oil industry would make him extremely rich, but it quickly became apparent that he needed some help. So John took on a new partner to help him run the company, a man named Henry Flagler, and the two men were remarkably similar. Like John, Henry wasn't interested in making a little money. He wanted to build an empire. That's why when John told him about his ambitious plans for Standard Oil, Henry was all in. He was also just as religious, disciplined, and determined as John. In fact, perhaps the only difference was that Henry was even more ruthless when it came to doing business. Henry approached business the same way he would approach war. The only way to win was to completely crush your enemy, and so John adopted this philosophy as well. You see, competition in the oil refining industry was quickly turning warlike. Now that others had uncovered how simple the refining process really was, Rockefeller's product was no longer unique. New brands of kerosene were popping up all over the market. So John and Henry began scheming and decided to form strategic alliances that would not only boost Standard Oil's profits, but also hurt their competitors at the same time. One example of this was when John secretly colluded with the railroads to get better transportation costs than all their competitors. At the time, oil was transported from one place to the other by an extensive network of trains, mostly dominated by three railroad companies: the New York Central, the Erie, and the most powerful company in America at the time, the Pennsylvania Railroad. Because of the way their routes were laid out, it was beneficial for the New York Central and the Erie railroads to carry oil to refineries in Cleveland. But for the Pennsylvania Railroad, it was more profitable to carry oil directly to New York City or Philadelphia. So the Pennsylvania Railroad declared that Cleveland would be wiped out as a refining center, and they pulled out of the city completely. After this news that the largest railroad was leaving the city, many refineries in Cleveland left the city too. This was a disaster for the New York Central and Erie railroads, who had made sizable investments in Cleveland, and they were now losing customers. So instead of joining the panicking crowd and leaving Cleveland, John saw that the Erie and New York Central railroads were in dire need for business, and he decided to use their desperation to his advantage. In exchange for a consistent flow of oil through their networks, John negotiated a deal with the Erie in which Standard Oil would get a 75% discount on the railroad's official shipping costs. And in exchange for a daily order of 60 carloads of refined oil, John negotiated another deal with the New York Central Railroad to pay $1.65 per barrel shipped, when the official rate was $2.40. So, with both railroads, John now had extremely favourable rates secured. And even though the railroads were reluctant to accept these lower prices, the guaranteed consistent shipments were irresistible to them. In fact, since these railroads went from shipping all sorts of things to focusing just on oil, they could simplify their operations and boost their profits. So it was win-win for everyone. Well, except for the Pennsylvania Railroad and Standard Oil's competitors. Because of the deal, Cleveland became the largest refining center in the country, and since the Pennsylvania Railroad had abandoned the city, it was at a steep disadvantage when trying to revive their business there. And of course, the discounts John had negotiated with the railways, known as railroad rebates, were kept a secret to Standard Oil's competitors, and so all the other oil businesses would have to pay the full price to transport their oil on the very same trains. And here's the thing, because John knew for a fact that his costs were now lower than all his competitors, he was able to trigger a price war. John would lower the price of his oil so that his competitors would have to do the same in order to remain competitive in the market. But since John knew his competitors were paying more than him to transport the oil and thus had higher costs, even if they charged the same price for their oil, John was still making more profit. He knew his competitors wouldn't be able to survive. So John kept slashing the prices, and eventually the price would go so low that some competitors would go bankrupt. Once they went bust, Standard Oil would have way less competition, so John could bump up the price again and charge even more than he did originally. It was brutal, but it was extremely effective. Now, John knew these railroad rebates were morally dubious. They gave bigger businesses hugely preferential treatment over smaller ones. However, it would be over a decade before any antitrust laws were passed to prevent these kind of monopolistic practices, so legally, John wasn't doing anything wrong, and thus, in the meantime, this warlike strategy to crush competitors was paying off, and Standard Oil raked in enormous profits. However, there was one major problem. The massive surplus of oil meant oil prices had fallen as low as $2.40 per barrel, and as more oil fields were found in Pennsylvania, it seemed that the price would continue to fall. The remaining competition was barely hanging on. In fact, John estimated that around 90% of oil refiners were actually losing money. But John began to fear that his individual success could be overshadowed by a total collapse of the entire oil industry. John was convinced that if they were facing a system-wide problem, they needed to find a system-wide solution for it. And John's solution would be to organize an even more dominant monopoly, the likes of which had never been seen before. By 1872, John and Henry were ruthlessly expanding Standard Oil, but oil prices had dropped another 25%. They knew if they didn't do something soon, the entire industry could collapse and they would fall right along with it. So John decided to collaborate with the president of the Pennsylvania Railroad, Tom Scott. John and Scott had been rivals after the deal John made with the other two main railroads, but now Scott was reaching out to make a similar secret deal that was even more ambitious and ruthless. Scott proposed a secret alliance between the largest railroads and a very select group of the largest refiners, which of course included Rockefeller. And thus, Standard Oil and the Pennsylvania, New York Central, and Erie railroads all formed an alliance together under the inconspicuous name of the South Improvement Company, or SIC for short. The deal was that in exchange for a secret 50% rebate on transportation costs, John would transport all his oil exclusively through these railroads. But John wasn't content with just getting benefits for himself. He designed the deal to be devastating for his competition. For example, when anyone outside of this secret alliance transported kerosene through these railroads, Standard Oil would receive a 50% rebate from the cost of their shipments as well. These were known as drawbacks, and they meant that Standard Oil's competitors would not only be paying higher prices to transport their oil on the same railroads, but some of that money would be going directly to Rockefeller. And to top it all off, the railroads would even secretly give John detailed information about their competitors' shipments. He would know every detail of his rivals' businesses, and so he could undercut them by selling kerosene for cheaper prices. Anyone outside this secret alliance stood no chance. It was a death sentence for anyone excluded from the club, and the worst of it was, they didn't even know it. However, whilst many of Rockefeller's critics call this whole arrangement a shameless power grab, to John, he truly believed it was the best way to save the oil industry. Because as things stood with so many competitors, their product was getting closer and closer to being given away for free, as there was so much supply of oil readily available. He believed wiping out these smaller refiners would help the oil industry overall. But either way, it didn't matter, because rumors of a railroad and refiner cartel soon began to spread. When people read in the newspapers that the rates for the 3 most important railroads in the country had doubled overnight, they knew exactly who to blame: Tom Scott of the Pennsylvania Railroad and John D. Rockefeller of Standard Oil. As rumors of the alliance continued to spread, thousands of people took to the streets to protest, threatening Standard Oil and the Pennsylvania Railroad with violence, vandalism, and arson. Protesters hijacked Standard shipments and spilled their oil, and they tore the Pennsylvania's train tracks from the ground. But the final blow to the SIC came when the oil miners made their countermove and boycotted the SIC. Without a supply of crude oil, John's refineries were useless, so 2 months after it was formed, the SIC had been disbanded. It was a humiliating event, one that brought a lot of negative attention on John. But John wasn't fazed by it. He simply decided if he couldn't control the oil industry through shady backroom deals, then he would do it in public, and conquer the industry by force. John wanted to bring as many refineries under Standard Oil as he could, and to his surprise, the SIC fiasco had actually caused one important change in the industry. Despite the very public fallout of the SIC alliance, there were still whispers of a secret railroad and refiner cartel, with many people paranoid that there must still be some kind of secret deal in place between the big railroads and the big refiners. Even though there wasn't, the rumors spread everywhere. Oil refiners were scared that if Standard Oil still had a secret deal with the railroads, they would get crushed, and John decided to leverage this threat to his advantage. In a period of 6 weeks, now known as the Cleveland Massacre, John managed to intimidate 22 out of the 26 oil refining companies in Cleveland into selling out for fractions of what their businesses were actually worth. So even though the SIC hadn't gone ahead, the fear it had created pressured many refiners into panic selling their companies to John. Plus, since many other refiners were losing money anyway, John would show them his company's finances so they could see how well Standard was doing, and to prove to them that he could outlast them all. For most refiners, the choice between fighting a losing battle and cashing out was obvious. And whenever anyone sold out, John gave them only 2 options. They could either sign a damning contract prohibiting them from ever joining the industry again, or they could join Standard Oil. Since most competitors chose to join Standard, John had the brightest minds in the industry working for him. All those entrepreneurs who'd been running their own companies were now brought under the Standard Oil umbrella into one giant company. Also, when the new refineries came under Standard's ownership, they outfitted them with the latest oil refining technology, which drastically cut costs. By mid-1873, John was in control of an empire with a growing number of highly efficient refineries that together could ship out over 1 million barrels of kerosene every year. He now had a monopoly over the Cleveland refineries. However, on September 18, 1873, a day historians call Black Thursday, a series of bank failures plunged the US economy into a national recession that lasted 6 years. For the first time, oil prices dropped not because there was too much supply, but instead because of a total lack of demand. Standard began operating only 2 of their 6 main refining plants in Cleveland. And a year after Black Thursday, a single oil barrel traded for as little as 48 cents. Less than the cost of an equal amount of water. So everyone from the miners to the railroads and the refiners were dreading their seemingly inevitable fate, bankruptcy. But thanks to Standard Oil's careful management of finances, excellent credit with banks, and their modernized refineries, John was one of the only refiners in the country who was able to still clear a profit. And as always, John regarded